Imagine you borrowed some grain from your neighbor last winter to survive. A bad harvest. Nothing unusual. You promised to pay him back, but the next season was worse, and the one after that. And now your neighbor is standing at your door, not to talk, not to negotiate, but to take your son. Not as punishment, not illegally, completely, utterly, by the law of the land. This wasn't a horror story. This was Tuesday in ancient Rome, 450 BC. And if you think what happened next was bad, wait until you hear what the actual law said creditors were legally allowed to do to you. We talk about debt like it's a modern problem. Student loans, credit cards, mortgages. But here's something almost nobody tells you. Debt is one of the oldest human inventions in existence. We have written debt records from ancient Mesopotamia going back to 3000 BC, a full 1,000 years before the wheel was widely used. In fact, historians now believe debt predates money. People were borrowing and repaying long before coins were ever minted, which means the question of what happens when you can't pay is also one of the oldest questions in human civilization. And the answers across different ancient cultures, they range from shockingly brutal to surprisingly compassionate, to one solution so radical that no modern government has dared repeat it in 2,500 years. Let's go through them. We start in the early Roman Republic, around 450 BC. Rome codified its first set of written laws, carved into 12 bronze tablets, and displayed publicly in the Forum so that every citizen could read them. They were called, appropriately, the 12 Tables, and Table 3 was dedicated entirely to debt. Here's how it worked. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you had 30 days of grace. That sounds reasonable. But after those 30 days, your creditor had the legal right to physically grab you in the street, in front of witnesses, and drag you before a magistrate. Then you got another 60 days. During those 60 days, your creditor was required to parade you through the marketplace on 3 consecutive market days and publicly announce the amount of your debt. This wasn't just humiliating, it was your last chance. If anyone in that crowd wanted to pay your debt and save you, they could step forward. Most of the time, no one did. If 60 days passed and the debt still wasn't paid, the creditor had 2 options under Roman law. The first, sell you into slavery, not figuratively, literally, across the Tiber River, outside Roman territory, so you'd lose your citizenship entirely along with your freedom. The second option is where Roman law becomes genuinely disturbing. If you had multiple creditors, multiple people you owed money to. The 12 Tables included a clause that has been debated by legal scholars for centuries. The Latin phrase is partus secanto. It was typically translated to mean, on the third market day, the creditors may cut him into pieces. Most historians believe this was meant literally. Each creditor would receive a proportional share of the debtor's actual physical body. The ancient Roman commentator Aulus Gellius noted, with what seems like relief, that no record of this provision ever being actually carried out exists. But the fact that Rome saw fit to write it into law tells you something important about how seriously they took debt. Now, before the full Roman system sets in, there was another option, and this one is fascinating. It was called nexum, and it was, in a way, a mercy. Before your creditor dragged you to court, you could enter into a nexum contract. You would stand before 5 Roman citizens in a formal ritual involving bronze scales and copper weights, the ancient symbols of property transfer, and pledge yourself as collateral. You were not technically a slave. You kept your Roman citizenship, but you were now legally bound to work for your creditor until the debt was repaid. You could be beaten. You could be kept in chains. Your creditor could, and often did, lend you out to others. You might offer your own son in your place to protect yourself. The Roman historian Livy documented cases where wealthy patricians kept stables of nexi, Debt bondsmen, working their estates for years, sometimes decades, with no realistic path to repayment because the interest kept compounding. The abuse got so severe that in 326 BC, Rome passed a law called the Lex Poetilia Papiria, abolishing nexum entirely. It was celebrated as the second founding of Roman liberty. One ancient source wrote that on the day the law passed, it felt as if the entire Roman people had been freed from slavery at once. But here's a grim footnote. Historians believe that the moment nexum was abolished, Roman aristocrats simply shifted their demand for cheap labor to actual slaves captured in war. The exploitation didn't end. It just changed its form. Meanwhile, in Athens, things had gotten equally desperate, and the solution chosen was radically different. By the early 6th century BC, Athens was in crisis. Years of bad harvests and war debt had pushed most of the free farmer class into servitude. The mechanism was simple and devastating. You could borrow against your own body. If you couldn't repay, your creditor didn't just take your land, he took you. Entire families had been sold out of Greece entirely, shipped abroad as slaves. In 594 BC, Athens handed extraordinary power to a man named Solon and said, "Fix this, or we collapse." What Solon did was almost incomprehensible by modern political standards. He canceled all debts, every single one. The Greek word for it was sisaktheia, which translates beautifully as the shaking off of burdens. Every debt record was erased. Every Athenian who had been enslaved for debt was freed. Every citizen who had been sold abroad was tracked down and brought home at state expense. The stone markers that had been driven into the ground of mortgaged farmlands were physically removed, one by one, across the Attic countryside. In a single act, Solon effectively reset the economic floor of an entire civilization. It worked, but it also created a political firestorm. The wealthy felt robbed. Those who had taken out loans in advance expecting a debt cancellation and bought land cheap felt cheated that he hadn't redistributed property as well. Solon himself wrote poems defending his choices that have survived to this day, with an almost modern tone of exasperation at being attacked from both sides. But the long consequence was profound. Freeing the debtor class from bondage is now credited as one of the key preconditions that made Athenian democracy possible just decades later. You can't build a democracy on a citizenry half enslaved to private creditors. But Greece wasn't actually the first civilization to figure this out. Go back to ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon, the very earliest urban civilizations on Earth. Historians have now documented at least 30 separate debt cancellations across Mesopotamian cities between 2400 BC and 1400 BC. 30. These weren't economic accidents. They were deliberate, recurring, institutionalized policy. Different cities had different words for it. Amargi in Lagash, Andurarum in Ashur, Misharum in Babylon. Hammurabi himself, the king famous for his law code, issued at least 4 debt cancellation edicts during his 42-year reign. His great-great-grandson issued the most complete one we've ever found, a clay tablet that reads, almost like a modern executive order wiping out categories of debt one by one. These weren't acts of charity. Mesopotamian kings understood something brutally pragmatic. When peasant farmers get crushed by debt, they abandon their land, stop paying taxes, stop feeding armies, and the whole agricultural economy collapses. Periodic debt relief wasn't compassion. It was system maintenance. Historians note a chilling data point. After 1400 BC, the debt jubilees in Mesopotamia stop, and shortly afterward, the archaeological record shows vast inequality, mass abandonment of agricultural land, the rise of a crushing landed elite class, and social collapse across the region. Some scholars connect these events directly. Others are more cautious. But the timing is hard to ignore. Here is the thing that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The ancient world, with its brutal debt slavery, and its bronze tablets, and its creditors literally owning human bodies, also produced the most radical debt relief mechanisms in all of recorded history. Kings in Babylon were canceling debts for 1,000 years before Athens did it. Athens freed an entire enslaved class and built democracy on that foundation. Even Rome, the most brutal system of all, eventually looked at Nexum and said, "This has gone too far. We live in a world where student debt, medical debt, and national debt are treated as permanent, unquestionable, morally sacred obligations, where the idea of debt cancellation is considered radical and dangerous." The ancient world would find that very strange. They had a word in Sumer 4,400 years ago for the freedom from debt, amargi. It is the oldest written word for freedom in all of human history. Think about that next time someone tells you debt forgiveness is a new idea.